Today's story isn't just news, it's a powerful reminder of what leadership used to look like and what it still can be. If you value truth, dignity, and someone who doesn't flinch when the lights get hot, you're in the right place. What happened on that stage in Savannah might just restore your faith in conviction. So grab a seat and let's revisit the moment when one calm voice silenced the noise and reminded America who still stands tall. The air inside Savannah's Liberty Forum Theater was thick with anticipation. Half the audience draped in American flag pins and MAGA ball caps, the other half in tailored jackets and cultural arts scarves. Two Americas, divided not just by ideology but by experience, had come face to face. At the center of it all stood the wooden stage, polished, historic, and soon to be a battleground of truth versus performance. The event billed simply as Art in America, a Conversation, had morphed into something else entirely, a symbolic clash between the Hollywood elite and the heartland voice of the people. Stage lights bathed the podiums in a soft amber glow as the moderator, veteran newsman Marcus Alden, adjusted his earpiece. The murmurs from the crowd were already rising, booming veterans' laughter on one side, polite chuckles on the other. When Karoline Leavitt stepped into view, the room shifted. In a tailored green suit, spine straight and eyes sharp, she looked every bit the youngest White House press secretary in American history. But there was nothing performative in her poise. She didn't wave. She didn't smile wide. She simply nodded, calm and deliberate, to the Americans who had come not for spectacle, but for truth. Then came Jim Carrey, the comedic icon turned political cartoonist, striding onto the stage with the swagger of someone who had owned the spotlight for decades. He wore a relaxed blazer and a mischievous grin, holding his tablet like a prop from one of his skits. The left side of the theater erupted into laughter and cheers. The right sat in stiff silence. Carrey raised his arms like a boxer entering the ring. Karoline didn't flinch. As both took their places, the backdrop behind them flickered, two enormous screens lighting up with American imagery. One, a Norman Rockwell painting of family, service, and tradition, the other, a stylized digital mural of protest signs, modern chaos, and Carrey's own artwork. The contrast was intentional. It wasn't just two guests debating. It was two worldviews facing off, raw and unfiltered. In that moment, no one was scrolling, no one was tweeting. They were watching, listening, waiting. Because tonight wasn't just another debate. It was a reckoning. The first strike didn't come with shouting, but with a smile. Jim Carrey leaned into his podium, tapped his tablet, and gestured to the massive screen behind him. It lit up with his newest piece, a chaotic painting titled The Puppet President. At its center stood a grotesque caricature of Donald Trump, with strings tangled in his fingers, surrounded by faceless figures in red hats stumbling blindly in a maze of television screens and dollar signs. In the corner, almost as an afterthought, stood a tiny figure labeled CL, holding a White House microphone like a megaphone, her face half hidden, her mouth replaced with a tweet icon. The room reacted immediately. The Hollywood side broke into applause and laughter. A few audience members whistled in approval, but across the aisle, the reaction was colder. Arms folded, jaws clenched. One Vietnam vet muttering under his breath, "Real brave," mocking people who'd take a bullet for this country. Carrey turned toward Karoline, voice slick with sarcasm. "Miss Leavitt," he began, drawing out the name like a punchline, "you defend a man who turned the White House into a punchline. I just painted the truth. Maybe you should hang this up next to your press briefings. At least it's honest." He waited for the laugh. It came. Half the room. The other half didn't move. They weren't here to be entertained. They were here to see if she'd blink. Karoline didn't. She stood still, fingers lightly resting on the podium, gaze locked on the screen. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, not defensive but deliberate. "You call this truth, Mr. Carrey, but it's just another painting of people you don't know, in places you've never walked, fighting battles you've never seen." Her eyes scanned the audience, pausing on a man in a worn navy cap, a woman with arthritic hands folded over a church bulletin. "You draw them blind," she continued, "but maybe it's you who refuses to see." The room grew still. Even Carrey paused, the usual smirk on his face faltering for just a second. Marcus Alden, the moderator, straightened in his chair. Something had shifted. This wasn't going to be a roast. It was becoming a reckoning. Karoline hadn't raised her voice, she hadn't thrown insults, but in those few lines she had flipped the dynamic. The first punch had landed, and it wasn't from the comedian. It was from the press secretary who had nothing to prove, but everything to defend. The camera didn't catch it, but Karoline remembered it clearly the moment she decided to walk into the lion's den. It wasn't in a meeting room at the White House or during a media briefing. It was in a dusty VFW hall just outside of Lexington, Kentucky. She had been there to speak with veterans about healthcare delays, but what stayed with her was the man who never made it to his feet. A triple amputee Marine, weathered and quiet, who simply whispered as she passed, "Just don't forget us." No fanfare, no anger, just a request spoken with the weight of 1,000 battles. Karoline had nodded, but something in her heart shifted. She knew the storm was coming, the attacks, the mockery, the media spin, but that voice reminded her why she wore the badge, why she stood at the podium, and why she would face down Hollywood on live television without blinking. This debate with Jim Carrey wasn't about political theater to her. It wasn't even about defending a president. It was about defending the people who no longer had a voice in the room, the farmers who hadn't seen a profit in 5 years, the steelworkers with worn-out boots and no pensions, the mothers working night shifts while being laughed at by people who'd never missed a meal. Karoline didn't see herself as a performer. She was a messenger, and her message was simple. We're not perfect, but we still believe, and we're not backing down. As the town halls got louder and the media grew more vicious, staffers urged her to decline the invitation to appear with Carrey. "It's a trap," one of them warned. "They want a soundbite, not a conversation." But Karoline had looked up from her notes and said, without hesitation, "I'm not going to let someone who paints our people as fools define us." And so she stood now, not to defend a man, but to defend a movement built not on applause, but on perseverance. Jim Carrey had come to perform, she had come to represent, and deep down, that made all the difference. Jim Carrey wasn't just waiting to debate, he was waiting to detonate. With a flourish, he turned back to the screen behind him and tapped his tablet again. The image changed. This time it wasn't a messy caricature or a vague insult. It was a striking digital painting, cold, detailed, and brutal. The artwork showed the White House transformed into a carnival funhouse. Mirrors distorted the American flag, a clown-faced Trump juggled nuclear buttons, and Karoline Leavitt stood at the podium with her face hidden behind a plastic mask painted with a cartoonish smile and the phrase, "Everything's fine." The crowd reacted instantly. The left side of the theater, Hollywood loyalists and coastal intellectuals, erupted with laughter and applause. A woman in a beaded jacket shouted, "That's real art!" Someone whistled, but across the aisle the atmosphere turned icy. A retired firefighter in the third row muttered, "That's not art. That's mockery." A veteran in full dress uniform shook his head slowly. Carrey raised his voice just enough to be heard over the noise. "This," he said, gesturing toward the glowing screen, "is what your America has become. A theater of delusion, propped up by slogans and masked press secretaries. We used to value truth. Now we sell hope like it's detergent." He smirked at Karoline. "So tell me, Miss Leavitt, when do the commercials end?" There was silence, tense, coiled silence. But Karoline didn't rise to the bait. She didn't flinch or blink or counter with a sharp retort. Instead, she took a quiet breath, her eyes never leaving the screen. Then she turned to the crowd, not to Jim, and spoke with the clarity of someone who'd been through this storm before. "You paint masks over people you've never met, Mr. Carrey," she said calmly. "But these aren't the faces of liars. These are the faces of Americans who've had to smile through broken paychecks, empty chairs at dinner tables, and funerals with no cameras. They don't wear masks. They wear sacrifice." A pause, then murmurs from the MAGA side. Applause began to rise, not theatrical but grounded, steady, earned. For the first time, Carrey's expression faltered. He looked at his screen again. The mask still smiled, but the crowd wasn't laughing like before. The first real blow had landed, and it didn't come from a paintbrush. It came from conviction. The room fell into an uneasy stillness. Jim Carrey had delivered what he thought was the finishing blow, a painting designed to humiliate, provoke, and dismantle. And for a moment, it seemed to work. Cameras panned across the stage, catching his confident smirk and Karoline's silence. But then she moved, not with outrage, not with desperation. She simply raised one hand, open, steady, deliberate, and the entire theater obeyed. The applause stopped. The laughter died. Even Carrey, sensing something shifting, leaned back just slightly. Karoline stepped forward, not with theatrics, but with intention. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped, low and firm, like a gavel in a courtroom. "You want to talk about truth, Mr. Carrey?" she said, eyes locked on him. "Let's talk about it." She turned her gaze to the audience. "Truth," she began, "isn't found in paint or pixels. It's found in the calloused hands of a farmer who wakes before the sun just to break even, in a sheriff's deputy who missed his daughter's birthday because duty doesn't clock out, in the single mom working 2 jobs and still packing her son's lunch with a note that says, 'I'm proud of you.'" The crowd was silent, captivated. Karoline paused, then motioned toward the glowing image of the funhouse White House. "You call this satire? I call it contempt. You draw these people as blind. But I've met them. I've shaken their hands. I've listened to their stories. And if you ever stepped off the stage and into their lives, you'd know. They're not lost. They're holding this country up while others mock them from mansions and late-night talk shows." The veterans began to nod. A man in the front row stood, hand over his heart. A few others followed. Then came the applause. Not wild, but forceful, like boots on hard wood. Carrey opened his mouth, but Karoline lifted her hand again. "I'm not finished." She walked toward the podium's edge. "You call me a mouthpiece, a mask. But I was elected to serve the American people, not entertain them. I came here tonight not to win a debate or trend online. I came here to remind you. Truth doesn't need a punchline," she paused. "It just needs to be said." That was it. The moment. The one history remembers. The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in conviction. Flags waved, phones filmed, and Jim Carrey, once master of the stage, now stood off to the side, the light catching just enough of his face to reveal it. He hadn't expected to lose control of the room, but in 5 sentences, Karoline Leavitt had taken it back, with one word: truth. The applause still echoed when Carrey finally spoke, but something in his voice had changed. The smooth sarcasm was still there, but it cracked around the edges. "You give a great speech, Miss Leavitt," he said, his eyes narrowing. "But speeches don't solve anything. Paintings speak louder than press releases." He tapped his tablet again, and a new image appeared. A still rendering of Karoline at the White House podium, her face covered by a porcelain mask, bearing a perfect smile. Above it, in sharp lettering, "The role of a lifetime." He looked to the audience, expecting another roar of approval, but this time only a handful responded. The rest sat still, waiting, not for art, but for answers. Carrey's smirk thinned. He pushed forward, trying to recover ground. "She says she stands for truth," he told the crowd, gesturing toward Karoline. "But the real truth is, you're all being played. The red hats, the slogans, the staged patriotism, it's theater, and she's the lead actress." He expected the line to land. Instead, a voice rang out from the back, an older man, gravel in his throat. "She's more real than anything you've done in 20 years. That one sentence hit harder than any painting. Carrey's posture shifted. He turned toward the voice, blinked twice, then looked down at the iPad still in his hand. The image on the screen, his ace, his final blow, suddenly looked small, overproduced, cold. He tried one more time. "I loved this country once," he said, softer now. "I painted because I wanted it to wake up." Karoline didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Her silence filled the room louder than any applause. Carrey scanned the audience, his audience. and realized many weren't with him anymore. Some sat with arms crossed, some looked away. The applause that had once fueled him had faded, replaced by a quiet that felt more like judgment than awe. For the first time all night, the man who had made a career commanding attention wasn't commanding anything at all. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Jim Carrey understood. He hadn't been debated, he had been revealed. Backstage after the break, Jim Carrey sat alone in the dim glow of the prep room, the sounds of the audience muffled by thick velvet curtains. The stage lights had faded, but their heat still lingered on his skin, a phantom warmth from a spotlight that no longer followed him. His tablet lay face down on the table, the screen blank, his earlier sketches now feeling juvenile. He stared at his reflection in a makeup mirror framed with dusty bulbs, wondering when the distance between himself and the country he claimed to paint had grown so wide. He thought of past stages, Oscar nights, comedy tours, political rallies, where laughter had been automatic and approval felt earned. But tonight there were no punchlines left, just questions. Why hadn't the painting worked? Why didn't they laugh? Why did that girl half his age cut deeper with 5 sentences than he could with 5 canvases? The answer sat in the silence. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped listening. He'd swapped dialogue for monologue, brushstrokes for broadcast. He had painted from frustration, not familiarity. On the screen earlier, Karoline hadn't shouted him down. She hadn't mocked his career or his beliefs. She had simply told the truth. Not a flashy truth or a headline-grabbing truth, but a grounded one, drawn from towns and voices he hadn't heard in years. And that truth had hit him harder than any critic ever had. Carrey ran a hand through his hair, exhaled. The crowd out there hadn't turned because of politics. They turned because they saw someone who still believed in something more than performance, and they saw someone else who was performing. In that quiet room, surrounded by mirrors and fading echoes of applause, Jim Carrey didn't feel anger. He felt absence, not just of control, but of connection. And for the first time that evening, he wasn't thinking of winning the debate. He was thinking about what it meant to be forgotten by the people you thought you were speaking for. In the quiet calm of the green room, Karoline Leavitt sat alone, her notes untouched beside her, the hum of distant applause still faint in the walls. Her staff hadn't rushed in right away. There was no loud celebration, no triumphant chants or high fives. Only the low buzz of a phone lighting up over and over again with messages, "You did it." He never saw it coming. Truth landed. But Karoline didn't smile right away. She knew something important had happened out there, but not in the way most would see it. She hadn't come to deliver a knockout. She had come to speak for those who couldn't walk onto that stage. The truth hadn't been a strategy, it had been a duty, and the fact that it struck the room like a lightning bolt wasn't because she was loud, clever, or rehearsed. It was because it had been real, unvarnished, lived. The voice that echoed across that theater wasn't just hers. It belonged to the steelworker who'd written her a letter about saving his job, to the pastor in rural Georgia who prayed for his town after it lost its factory, to the father who told her he'd missed his son's graduation because he couldn't get off a double shift. She picked up her phone and opened a video already circulating on X and TikTok, a clip of her raising her hand, voice calm as she said, "Truth doesn't need a punchline, it just needs to be said." The video was barely 30 seconds long, but it had already gathered millions of views. The caption read, "Karoline, calm, clear, unstoppable." She scrolled through comments, most from people she'd never met. "That's how you lead. Truth still matters." One stood out. From a Vietnam veteran, "You spoke for us tonight. Thank you for not flinching." Her fingers hovered above the keyboard before she typed simply, "Sir, I never will." Meanwhile, just beyond the green room door, media outlets scrambled. Fox News was already calling it the Savannah standoff. CNN tried to soften the blow, labeling the debate a generational clash. But the people who had been in that room, and the millions watching from home, already knew. This wasn't just about Karoline and Carrey. It was about what happens when someone finally says what the rest are too polished or too proud to admit. Back on stage, the host's chair sat empty. The lights were dimming, but Karoline's words still hung in the air, like the ring of a bell long after it struck, and in living rooms, on smartphones, and in quiet places across the country, especially among those who'd seen too many leaders say too little, that voice was still echoing. Far from the stage and the flashing lights of Liberty Forum Theater, two lives moved in opposite directions. Jim Carrey sat alone in his private studio, the high ceilings echoing with the quiet that follows a lost performance. A half-finished painting stood in front of him, a sketch of the White House surrounded by a tangle of vines. Trump was at the center, his features still missing. Carrey's brush hadn't touched the canvas in hours. He stared at the lines, but they no longer spoke to him. His hands, once animated with the energy of satire, now trembled slightly with hesitation. The colors that once poured out of anger now felt hollow. Satire didn't land tonight. Truth had. And it hadn't come from a punchline. It came from the kind of clarity he hadn't found in years. He opened his laptop, scrolled through social media. The hashtag Truth by Karoline was still trending. Every third post was a clip of her speech, her hand raised, her words cutting through the noise like a signal through static. He read the captions, each more jarring than the last. Truth wins. Carrey exposed. Hollywood silenced. The same internet that once made him a star had turned into a mirror, and he didn't like what he saw. Meanwhile, at the White House, Karoline Leavitt stepped into the early morning briefing room. The podium stood under the same soft lights as always, but this time something was different. The staff watched her not as a spokesperson, but as a leader. She was no longer just the youngest press secretary in history. She had become something more. A symbol that truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. That conviction, when steady, doesn't buckle under spotlight or satire. As she approached the mic, reporters hushed. Phones and cameras clicked into position. She looked out, not at the press, but through them, as if seeing the thousands beyond who'd watched her stand her ground the night before. And then, with the same quiet certainty that had dropped the room in Savannah to silence, she said, "Truth is our strength, not because it's easy, but because it endures." Across the country, men who had watched from worn recliners, garage TVs, and hospital beds nodded quietly. They'd seen something familiar in her, something their generation understood, that real leadership doesn't strut. It stands. That conviction isn't found in applause, but in the silence that follows when you've said what needs to be said. And as the camera panned across Karoline's face, composed and resolute, Jim Carrey closed his laptop, leaned back in his chair, and whispered to no one, "She's not the actress. I was." The lights dimmed. But the truth remained. The story of Karoline Leavitt and Jim Carrey at the Liberty Forum Theater is more than a political clash. It's a powerful reminder that truth, when spoken with quiet conviction, will always outlast noise, mockery, and performance. In an era where headlines are crafted for clicks and outrage is mistaken for courage, Karoline proved that integrity doesn't need to shout to be heard. She didn't win by overpowering her opponent, but by standing steady in who she was and who she represented. The forgotten, the working, the unseen backbone of America. Jim Carrey, once the voice of satire, discovered the cost of losing touch with the people he thought he spoke for. His performance fell flat not because of a lack of talent, but because it lacked humility. The real victory wasn't Karoline's alone. It was a win for every American who still believes dignity matters more than drama. The lesson is clear. In a divided nation, truth isn't a weapon, it's a light. It doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be real. And in that stillness, the right voice will echo longer than the loudest noise. Let the world perform. You just speak the truth.